I was driving home, exhausted after a long day in court. My cases usually involved fraud and corruption, but today I had to hear aggravating circumstances in a domestic violence case. It was tough, but not enough to knock me off balance. I was used to the filth, the hypocrisy of people hiding behind the masks of respectable citizens. It was hard to surprise me. And then there he was, a patrol officer behind the wheel of his car who decided I posed a threat. As soon as I noticed his car, I knew I'd be stopped. I had faced this too many times. The confident look, the smug grin. Again, I thought as he turned on his siren. I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. A thought flashed through my mind. Let's see how far you'll go, officer. He approached the window, his face full of contempt, as if I was something dirty. License and registration, he said, not even bothering to look at me. I pulled out my documents, trying to remain calm. His eyes gleamed when he saw I was black. Well, what do we have here? He said with a smirk. I stayed silent, knowing that saying anything was pointless. He had already made up his mind about me, but he should have been more careful with his assumptions. The insults came quickly. You know, people like you shouldn't be driving cars like this, he said, eyeing my vehicle. I looked at him, not responding. Anger was building inside me, but I knew I had to stay calm. You think everyone's equal here? He continued. His voice was filled with disdain, emphasizing the word you, as if to highlight that I didn't belong. Officer, do you really need to do this? I finally asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He sneered and snatched my documents away. Yes, I do, he said and pulled out handcuffs. You're under arrest for disrespecting the police, he said, snapping the cuffs onto my wrists. I felt the cold metal against my skin and knew this was far from over. He was searching my car while I stood on the roadside in handcuffs. People around were filming it on their phones, whispering. I saw fear in their eyes, but I wouldn't let myself be afraid. I was one step ahead of him. When they put me in the patrol car, I decided I would play by his rules until it was time to reveal my hand. They took me to the station and threw me in a cell as if I were some criminal. The cell was filthy, with a stench that was hard to ignore. I looked around, seeing other detainees, women who were giving me curious looks. They were trying to figure out who I was and why I was there. I sat on the bench and smiled to myself. No one had a clue that among them sat a federal judge. The police officer, the same one who had arrested me, approached the cell. How do you like it here? He asked, his voice dripping with venom. I raised my head and looked him straight in the eyes. You made a huge mistake, officer, I said quietly, but loud enough for him to hear. You have no idea who I am. His face paled when he heard my words. He tried to say something but fell silent, realizing the situation had changed. I watched as he backed away, feeling a growing satisfaction inside me. The game had begun, and I was ready to play it to the end. He thought he was in control, but soon he would realize he had become part of my game. The courtroom, not a place for the weak. I was used to having to fight for my rights and survive in a world where everyone is ready to betray you for their own gain. I was surrounded by lawyers, prosecutors, witnesses, all the people I knew from my work. But this time, I was not the judge. I was the defendant. They tried to hurt me, to humiliate me, to make me feel powerless. But they didn't stand a chance. The police officer who brought me here was confident in his victory. I saw the gleam in his eyes as he told his boss about my arrest. He thought he had won, that he had humiliated me in front of everyone. But he didn't know that I had always been one step ahead. I played this game better than anyone, and my game was just beginning. Sitting on the bench, I thought about how everything would unfold. I knew my lawyer had prepared all the documents. I knew I had evidence that would turn the whole case upside down. My hands were steady, even though my heart was beating faster than usual. I couldn't wait for the moment when everything would come to light. When the trial started, I sat calmly, listening as the prosecutor read the charges. His words were full of contempt, as if he was speaking to a criminal. But I looked at him, not blinking, knowing that every word he said was just noise, powerless. The court will hear the testimony of Officer Jones, the prosecutor said. The police officer who had arrested me stood up and began to speak. His voice was confident, but I could see his hands trembling. He was telling how he stopped me, how I allegedly resisted, how he had to use force. I sat there, listening to his lies, smiling to myself. He didn't know that I had recorded everything on my phone. He didn't know I had witnesses. He didn't know I was a judge who had exposed many like him before. When he finished, the judge turned to me. "Mrs. Smith, do you have anything to say?" I stood up. The courtroom fell silent. "Yes, Your Honor," I said calmly. I took out my phone and played the recording. The sound filled the room. His insults and humiliations were clearly heard on the recording. It showed him handcuffing me without cause. As they listened, I saw the expressions on people's faces change. Even the judge was shocked. When the recording ended, silence hung in the room. I saw the officer standing there, pale. He looked at me, not understanding what had happened. I was savoring the moment. "Your Honor, I am filing a complaint for discrimination and police misconduct," I said. My lawyer stood up and began to read the complaint. Officer Jones tried to object, but no one was listening. Everyone knew I was right. He had made a mistake, and now he would have to pay for it. The judge was silent for a moment and then said, "Officer Jones, you are suspended from duty pending investigation." His words sounded like a sentence. I saw the police officer's face go white. He looked at me, trying to understand how this had happened, but I just smiled. "Did you think you had it all under control?" I wanted to say, but I kept silent, watching his defeat. As I was leaving the courtroom, I heard the officer shouting something after me, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the crowd. I knew this was only the beginning. Now that I had shown what I was capable of, he would never dare to humiliate me again. He thought this game would be over quickly, but he didn't know I played by my own rules, and his turn was already over. I couldn't get his face out of my mind. Officer Jones thought it was all over, that I would back down and leave it in the past, but he was wrong. After he was suspended, he tried to lie low and disappear, but I knew there was more behind that mask. People with that mentality rarely stop at just one victim. He was confident in his impunity, and that irritated me the most. I knew he had skeletons in his closet, and I intended to find them. I needed to dig deeper, to look into his past, to understand who he really was. And so, I began my investigation. I hired a private detective to gather information. My goal was to find his weak spot and strike it with such force that he would never recover. Those weeks of investigation were full of anger and determination. I couldn't let this man go unpunished. From my judge's seat, I had seen too much injustice to turn a blind eye now. He had a reputation as a brutal cop, but there wasn't enough evidence. I knew I would find it. The information the detective provided was shocking. Officer Jones had beaten detainees, fabricated evidence, and covered for his colleagues when they broke the law. I obtained access to confidential reports, witness testimonies that never made it to court. All of this lay on my desk, and I knew I had his downfall in my hands. I decided to act. The first step was to prepare the public. I contacted journalists and gave them some of the information to start building their stories. "We need to show everyone who he really is," I told one of them. The journalists jumped at the story. They craved exposure, and I was ready to give them what they wanted. I started with small leaks, news about his brutal methods, the fabrications. All of it appeared in the media with alarming regularity. His superiors began to wonder where these leaks were coming from. His colleagues started to avoid him. I watched him lose control and enjoyed it. He tried to fix the situation, to cover his tracks, but it was too late. I knew it was time to deliver the final blow. I organized a press conference, inviting everyone who mattered in this city. I was ready to lay all my cards on the table. The room was packed with journalists, cameras, microphones, flashes. Everything was set for a grand show. I stood before them and began to speak, revealing what Officer Jones had been hiding all these years. He's not just a police officer, he's a monster in uniform. "I will show you the evidence," I said, and behind me on the screen appeared photos of beaten detainees, documents proving the fabrications, Witnesses who had been afraid to speak, but had decided to, knowing the truth would finally come out. To be out. Suddenly, I heard a commotion at the entrance. It was him. Officer Jones burst into the room, his face twisted with rage. He tried to push his way to the stage, shouting, threatening me, demanding that I stop all of this. But journalists surrounded him, cameras capturing his every move, every gesture. I looked down at him as if he were an actor who had forgotten his lines. The crowd surrounded him. Cameras recorded his every attempt to defend himself. He was arrested right then and there for threats and violence. He thought he could hide. He thought that if he left his job, kept quiet, and stayed out of sight, I would forget about him. How naive. After the humiliation he suffered at the press conference, Officer Jones disappeared from view. All those who had supported him before turned their backs as soon as things started to heat up. He was left alone. But I needed more. I wanted him to feel the full horror of his situation, to be afraid every minute of his life. I hired a private investigator and a few journalists to follow him, to track his every move. I knew he would try to hide, but in this city it was impossible to escape me. I knew he was trying to start a new life, but he didn't realize he couldn't just walk away from me. I found out he had an affair on the side, that he had a mistress. This was his last chance to cling to something from his old life, and it was my chance. I planned to manipulate this woman, to use her weaknesses and fears against him. He didn't know that his world was crumbling before his eyes and that I held the keys to his downfall. This was my game, and I relished every moment of it. I found her address, learned everything about her habits and the places she frequented. Her name was Lisa, and she worked at a small cafe near the city center. That day, I went to the cafe as a regular customer and sat at the counter. Lisa served me, not knowing who I was or why I was there. She looked tired but kind. I almost felt sorry for her for a moment, but that feeling passed quickly. She was the key to my plan, and I wasn't going to miss this chance. "Lisa, you're seeing Johnson, right?" I asked, pretending we were old friends. She froze, dropping a cup. I smiled at her, confident in my power. "You don't know who he really is. He's deceiving you. He thinks you're just a toy." Lisa tried to walk away, but I grabbed her hand. "I have information. We can help each other. He's using you, and you can use him." Her eyes filled with tears, and I knew I had her. She didn't know who to trust or what to do. "What do you want?" she asked, looking me straight in the eye. "Do you want revenge?" I asked, knowing the answer would be yes. "Help me. Tell me everything you know about him, his plans, his secrets." Day by day, Lisa told me more. She became my spy, my eyes and ears. Through her, I learned Jones's every move. He tried to stay hidden, looked around paranoid, suspected everyone, but he didn't know he'd been betrayed by the one he thought was his ally. I knew he was planning to leave town, to start a new life. He had rented a room in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, hoping no one would find him there. But I was already there when he arrived. I met him in the dimly lit hallway, standing by the door to his room. He was shocked. "You? What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice trembling. I smiled. "You thought you could run? Hide," I asked, holding a folder of incriminating evidence in my hands. "I have everything, all your dirty secrets. You tried to escape, but now you're trapped." His face turned pale, and he tried to open the door, but I was one step ahead. "If you try to leave, all this will come out. I'll tell everyone. You'll lose everything you have left. So think carefully, Jones. Your life is in my hands." He dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face. I savored his suffering, feeling my victory. "You thought you could avoid punishment?" I asked, feeling my smile grow wider. "No, darling, this game isn't over yet. I thought I had already destroyed him." Officer Jones was a broken, desperate man. His world had collapsed. But it turned out he was still clinging to the remnants of his life. The human tenacity to maintain the illusion of their righteousness has always been a mystery to me. He didn't want to admit defeat. He reached out to a journalist, hoping the man would help him restore his reputation, by telling the truth about how I had destroyed him. It was so predictable that I almost laughed when I found out. Of course, I knew about their plans before they even started to act. I had my sources, my people who watched his every move. I knew he would want to portray himself as the victim, as someone who had suffered at the hands of a corrupt judge. His pathetic attempt to gather dirt on me was nothing more than a childish game, but I enjoyed watching him desperately try to fight back. All this time, I sat in my office smiling, imagining how everything would turn against him. If he wanted a game, then he would get one. But now I would play by my rules, and this time I would decide how it would end. The morning started quietly. I was sitting in my office when a notification came about a new article. Jones and the journalist he hired had made the first move. The article described how a decent police officer was unjustly accused and humiliated. It was full of accusations against me. Lies, manipulations, abuse of power. Everything that could tarnish me was there. I read the article with interest, as if it were a captivating detective story. I knew what would follow. They planned a press conference to present their evidence and convince the public of my guilt. They hoped to ignite a scandal, to make me defend myself, to justify myself. But I knew what to do. I prepared an anonymous letter with proof that Officer Jones was lying and that he had been bribed to create this story. I included photos, recordings of conversations, everything needed to dismantle his plan. This time, I decided to play by their rules. I sent the letter to the journalist, knowing he wouldn't resist the temptation to conduct his own investigation. Later that day, I called him. "Are you sure about your source?" I asked with a hint of irony. The journalist fell silent. I could hear his brain feverishly processing the information. "If you're looking for the truth, you should be more careful about whom you trust," I said, ending the call. When the press conference began, I watched the live stream. The journalist looked tense, his hands slightly trembling. Officer Jones stood beside him, his face showing a mixture of confidence and fear. They started talking, presenting their evidence. I watched as the journalist looked at the documents Jones held, his eyes widening slightly. He knew something was wrong. "Recently, I received an anonymous letter," the journalist said, and I smiled. He began reading the information I had sent him. At first, quietly, then his voice grew more confident. Jones tried to interrupt, but no one listened to him. The journalist continued to expose the lies, to prove that the entire story was fabricated. The crowd started murmuring, then shouting. Jones tried to explain, to defend himself, but his voice was drowned out by the noise. In the eyes of the public, he was utterly discredited. When the crowd began booing him, he looked like a beaten dog, cornered. I savored the moment. Watching it all, I couldn't help but laugh. "Next time, be more careful when choosing your allies," I thought, feeling that my show was reaching its climax. Now that all the cards were on the table, I knew I had won for good. Everything was almost finished. Officer Jones was defeated, his career destroyed, his reputation in ruins. But that wasn't enough. I knew that somewhere deep down, he still hoped to escape the trap. He was hiding like a cornered animal, afraid of every sound, every shadow. I watched him through my people and knew he was planning to end his life. He thought death would be his salvation, the final act by which he could regain control, but I couldn't let him go so easily. That would be too easy, too merciful. Jones needed to experience the same despair he had made me feel. I couldn't allow him to find peace, not even for a moment. Death would have been a release for him, but I wanted him to suffer. I made a decision. I had to stop him. I had to offer him a deal. This was my last chance to savor his downfall. I needed to see him broken, humiliated, completely destroyed. I found him in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. He looked like a ghost, his skin pale, his eyes sunken. His gaze was empty, as if he were already dead. He held a gun in his hands, but didn't raise it when I entered. He knew resistance was futile. We stared at each other silently, and I saw his eyes slowly fill with despair. "You think death is an escape?" I asked, looking down at him. He didn't respond, but his eyes were filled with pain. "You think I'll let you go so easily?" I continued, feeling cold satisfaction growing inside me. He lowered the gun and sat on the floor, clutching his head in his hands. "What do you want?" he whispered. His voice trembled like a leaf in the wind. I smiled. "It's simple. You will make a public apology to me and to everyone you've wronged. You will confess to all your crimes. Only then will I not release the information I have gathered on you." His face twisted with horror, but he knew he had no choice. This was his only chance to avoid the worst. He nodded slowly, as if every movement brought him pain. "Okay, I'll do it," he said quietly. I knew he was broken, that he could no longer fight. I had won. The day he was to make his statement was sunny. The sky was clear, and the crowd had gathered in the square, waiting for the show. I sat in the front row watching Jones. His face was pale, his eyes full of fear. He stood on the stage, looking at the crowd like a pack of predators ready to tear him apart. I want to apologize," he began, his voice shaking like a broken machine. He spoke, but the words sounded empty, lifeless. "I made mistakes. I was wrong." His eyes met mine, and I saw a plea for mercy in them. I knew he hoped this would bring him salvation. When he finished, I stood up. The crowd fell silent, waiting for me to speak. I looked at him, then at the people around. "Do you think this is enough?" I asked, my voice full of icy contempt. "No, he's lying. Everything he said is a lie." I raised my hand, and the screen behind me started showing photos, documents, videos, everything I had collected against him. The crowd gasped. Jones tried to say something, but his voice was drowned out by the shouting. His face twisted in horror. He tried to justify himself, but no one listened. His life was utterly destroyed. He stood there, in the midst of the crowd, his head bowed like a beaten dog. I looked at him and felt the satisfaction growing inside me. "You wanted to be a hero, but you became a laughingstock. Perhaps this is true justice," I thought, watching as they took him away. All the cards had been played, and the pieces were set on the board just the way I wanted. Jones was destroyed, and I relished it. But deep down, I felt I needed more. It wasn't enough to ruin his career and reputation. I wanted him to suffer for the rest of his days. I wanted every day of his life to be filled with fear, pain, and regret. He needed to remember me every second of his life. I wrote him a letter. Every word in it was calculated, every phrase a blow to his weak heart. I described in detail how I had enjoyed his downfall, how I had witnessed his despair and fear. I told him he was nothing but a pawn in my game, a toy I manipulated at will. His life meant nothing, and he himself was nothing. I knew these words would eat away at him from the inside like poison. When the letter was sent, I imagined him opening the envelope, his eyes darting over the lines, his hands trembling, tears filling his eyes. He knew he would never forget this letter. It would haunt him like a shadow that would never fade. A few days later, I heard that Jones had become a recluse, barely leaving his house. His eyes were empty, his face pale as a corpse. Rumors about his condition spread through the town like wildfire. He was a living dead man, a person without a future, without hope. I knew he had read my letter. I knew my words had been the final nail in his coffin. He tried to find solace in alcohol, but every time he looked in the mirror, he saw his defeat. His face reflected all the horror he had experienced. I knew that every day was a torment for him, every morning a nightmare from which he could not wake. I watched his downfall like a spectator in a theater, knowing the end was near. I saw him begin to lose his mind, his eyes wandering, his words becoming meaningless. He tried to fight, but it was a battle with himself. He had lost before he even began. I learned of his death when I received a message from one of my people. Jones had hanged himself in his apartment. He left a farewell note admitting his defeat. He knew he could never forget me. that I had become his nightmare, his punishment. I stood at his funeral, watching his family. They cried, spoke of him as a good man who had done much for the community. They didn't know the truth, but it didn't matter to me. I had won. When everyone had left, I remained standing in front of his grave. Looking at it, I smiled. I knew Jones had been broken, that his life had become a hell he couldn't escape. He thought he could beat me, but I had always been one step ahead. You thought you could win? No, darling, I was always one step ahead, I said, looking at the grave. I turned and walked away, knowing this game was over and I was its victor.